Thank you all for being here. First of all, some thank yous to everybody. Thank you, of course, to Stefan and to Beth for the very kind introduction, so I appreciate that. Thank you to Helen Murdoch and to the History Associates for having me here to talk about my work. And of course, thank you to all of you for coming and listening to me today. My talk today will be on the Roman-Egyptian city of Oxyrhynchus, which we've heard a little bit about now at this point. It's in Middle Egypt. Egypt is a fascinating place because we have quite a bit of evidence about both very Egyptian, or very old and ancient Egyptian civilization, but also everything up to the Roman period, which I study, and further on. And this is because Egypt is a very dry place. Many objects and written documents have been preserved for thousands of years in this climate. Still, sometimes this evidence doesn't always align in terms of place and time. But the city that I study, Oxyrhynchus, is special in that it is one of the most fruitful sites both for excavating Roman period papyrus documents, literature, and letters, and also material culture as of recently. British excavators at the turn of the century were able to unearth something like 500,000 papyrus books, scrolls, individual sheets, fragments, which they all took back with them to Oxford. This large textual archive is supported by new archaeological discoveries today by Catalan and Egyptian excavators, thus giving us the ability to understand this one city from multiple angles. And it gives us a multidimensional understanding of what daily life might have been in this provincial town. Now, I say daily life because many of the texts and objects left behind by the people of Oxyrhynchus are often daily life objects. They're ephemera, right? They're materials that people didn't produce to leave some kind of lasting legacy, but just objects they used in their daily life. And I show some here, objects that are in the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London as of today. Combs, lamps, inkwells and pens, in addition to papyri letters, rag dolls for children's play, marbles for the same, pitchers of water, and a pair of cozy red socks, which I always love that item. These kinds of ephemera can tell us all kinds of interesting details about how ancient people lived their lives, and my research focuses on a very specific kind of object that falls into this category: amulets. What can amulets teach us about the lives of ancient Egyptians? These items don't immediately give us a sense of what they might have been used for. A toy, a pen, an article of clothing is readily understandable to us, but these things, these little images, various sort of trinkets inscribed with various prayers, might not be quite as obvious. At least they weren't initially obvious to me. But to get at the use and meaning of these sorts of things might explain what amulets, it might be important to explain what amulets even are, so I'll take some time here to do that. To help answer this question for us, I'll defer to Christopher Faraoni, who has been giving excellent discussion of amulets for decades now, and is using the definition that I work with for my dissertation work. Amulets refers to any object, plant, animal, or mineral, natural or man-made, image or text that the Egyptians placed upon their bodies, their domestic animals, homes, ships, vineyards, or cities in the hopes of protecting themselves, of curing some illness, or of gaining some kind of benefit, usually understood in the abstract, things like charisma, prosperity, victory, these sorts of things. The potential uses of these objects gives us a fascinating opportunity. That is, we can highlight our ancient people's daily concerns. What did they want to protect? What did they want to cure? What benefits did they need in their lives? Who was supposed to impart these benefits, these cures, and these protections? And how was that help supposed to be garnered? All of these questions get us to the heart of some of the most important aspects of ancient life and worldview. And so I will be dividing this talk today between 4 different amulets. It originally was 6, but I can't talk that long, unfortunately. I want to talk about it, but I unfortunately just don't have the time. These 4 amulets that you see here, they all come from Oxyrhynchus during the 3rd and 4th centuries. This was a time in which the religious scene in the Roman world was profoundly changing and was profoundly rich. Egypt was home not only to native Egyptian, Greek, and Roman ideas about how the world and the gods work, but also Judaism and emergent Christianity. All of these people brought their own ideas and sensibilities to provincial cities like Oxyrhynchus. Now, the first three here will allow us to get our bearings and understand what kinds of characteristics amulets can have and what's really important we can glean from them, or what really important insights we can glean from them about the concerns of daily life. Egyptian beliefs about the world around them, and Egyptian practices for interacting with that world and addressing those concerns. Each amulet will suggest new insights and offer new challenges that we'll track throughout the lecture, which will come to a head with our fourth amulet here, which will try to employ all of those insights to interpret this less straightforward object. So, let's get started. The first object I want to show you is Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 5310, which is a fever amulet for a man named Plusios. Now, this amulet gets its name from the collection it was first published in, right? So, based upon this name, we know that this was published in volume 82 of the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, and it was the 5,310th papyrus fragment to be published. Now, I told you earlier that we have about 500,000 of these things, so we have a lot to go through, but we won't do that today. This amulet can be read in a couple ways, but it's fairly straightforward, so it's a good place for us to start. With this amulet, I'm going to try and illustrate how Roman period Egyptians thought about illness, the causes of illness, and how to counteract those causes of illness. Now, this amulet is made, of course, from papyrus, as the name suggests. Papyrus is a kind of reed with a triangular stalk that, when sliced long ways, is laid out in strips and then beat into sheets of paper. These sheets are really durable. If not exposed to moisture, they can last in good condition, as you see on the screen, for thousands of years. And also, it figures a figure drawing up here, a little figure in the center, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So, let's extract the text here. This is what it would read in a little bit more legible Greek, and what it says in English. Relieve Plusios from the shivers. The first word, pauson, or relieve, is a command. So the amulet addresses some entity that has the power to stop these shivers. This entity is clearly powerful, but it is supernatural in addition. That is, it's beyond our world. We know this because of these letters alpha that you can see in groups of 9 in these kind of boxes arranged around the incantation at the center of this amulet. Vowels are really interesting letters in a Greek context. They were considered powerful in the ancient world. In Greek, consonants were associated with the body, while vowels, which were breath moving through the lungs and the mouth unrestricted, were associated with the soul itself. Breath was a sort of divine wind that moves through us and animates us, and thus the soul was thought to be connected very closely to the breath of a person. Thus, vowels were used in many prayers and incantations to speak directly to the gods. It was a kind of pure speech that one could use to access higher planes of existence, and thus would take one's prayers more speedily to the ears of the divine. Now, we also have this figure standing above the text, this little guy right here. Now, we can guess at some potential identities for the receiver of the prayers based upon this image. It could be the Egyptian god Anubis, who is associated with dogs or jackals. The head of the figure kind of looks like it could be a dog, maybe. So let's consider this option. Anubis, as you may know, is the god of cemeteries and of embalming. That is, the process of death and the transfiguration of the body in the afterlife. In the Roman period, Anubis is also often considered useful in attraction spells. That is, Anubis can help you attract somebody romantically. But that's not what this amulet is doing, right? We're trying to solve a shiver problem, so let's move on from Anubis, maybe not our culprit here. Let's consider instead the other option, the god of the forces of chaos, Seth, the brother of Osiris, who fought Horus, who Horus actually had to defeat to restore order to Egypt. Seth is often portrayed as an enemy of the ordered universe that the majority of the gods desire. So what on earth is he doing on this amulet to solve shivers? His aid is strange here, but we can actually understand it a little bit better if we consider that Seth is understood as a powerful defender against the forces of chaos, which seems maybe to be an inversion of what we might expect, but it makes some sense. If you're taming something dangerous, you can use it against those dangerous things, right? You can use Seth's knowledge of the chaotic powers to defend you against those very same chaotic powers. Indeed, Seth is often depicted in Egyptian art as protecting the sun god Ra as he passes nightly through the underworld, defending the sun from the quintessential monster of chaos, Apophis, which you can see right over here. But this points us to an important belief that Plusios had about his own shivers. That is, they were the work of the forces of chaos in the world. Plusios becomes Ra in his solar bark, sailing through the underworld, with Seth fighting off the monster of shivers. So based upon all of this, what can we say about what challenges Plusios faced? Well, we know that Plusios was ill with the shivers, that Plusios believed that illness was the cause of the forces of chaos in the world, dare we say demonic forces, and that the god of chaos, Seth, was the entity from whom Plusios sought help. Now, this points us to the fact that illness was a kind of concern that amulets could help with, as we've already talked about. Additionally, this points us to the fact that Plusios felt that this illness was not of natural causes, it was spiritual oppression by demonic forces. Indeed, for many ancient people, the question was not what was making one sick, but who. Lastly, we can say that Seth was still worshipped in Roman Egypt, even as late as the 3rd and 4th centuries, right alongside Greek and Roman gods and the Jewish and Christian god as well. Okay, so the next amulet I want to show you is Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 5308, which is a fever amulet worn by a woman named Arete. Now, I love this amulet, in particular because it'll give us some insights into other features of amulets that we're going to be needing and are going to be very important for us going forward. With Plusios' amulet, we are going to encounter the idea that there might be, with Plusios' amulet, we encountered the idea that sometimes a god's identity isn't always certain. We had to kind of decide probably Seth over Anubis. Now, those problems are going to multiply infinitely with this particular amulet. We're not going to know what god is being invoked here. There are many names associated with the god here, and none of them are going to give us a satisfactory answer, either for who the god is or even the religious sensibilities of Arete. The other feature I want to emphasize is how these amulets were made and used. Many amulets were created using formula books that described how to make amulets for various ailments and daily challenges. This amulet can point to how some of these formula books were actually used by people and not actually followed very closely. So, as we can see, this one is also made of papyrus, and it bears a Greek prayer as well as the invocation of names that I've just discussed. But there's no images, unfortunately, drawn upon it anyway. It's all text. So let's extract that text. Here is our Greek version, a little bit more legible, and what it says in English. Remove tertian shivers and fever with shivering and every illness from Arete, whom Amonis bore, because she is a slave of the great god, Yau Sabaoth Abrasaxilailam Yapin Kalom Yareo Bazagra. Tie cloth to the right bicep with a holy thread from a garment, and it ceases altogether. Arete is also ill, just like Plusios. She has a kind of fever called tertian fever, which we think might have something to do with malarial fever. Now, firstly, I want to draw your attention to the entity being invoked in this amulet, which I'm going to highlight here. Arete is called the slave of a so-called great god. This sort of phrase has multiple attestations in Egyptian spells and amulets. Now, the term great god here is Greek, so megas theos, but it's probably a translation of an older Egyptian phrase, netir'ah and netirwer. Now, these terms can be applied to a number of different Egyptian gods, so it's not going to exactly give us a sense of who we're talking about, so let's go further. Let's see what else we can get. To refer to oneself as the slave of a god, a doule here, is actually a really Christian thing to do. Many authors of early Christian texts often refer to themselves and their co-religionists as slaves of their Lord Jesus and their God. Now, these divine names, which I've just highlighted here for you, are actually a really common feature in spells and amulets in the Mediterranean world. We know that they are being used as divine names, which some of you might be able to see on the amulet over there. There are a bunch of lines drawn over the names, which indicate, as a usual practice, to signal you're drawing a divine name. And one of the interesting things here is we can actually detect several Hebrew words for God, several Hebrew divine names. We have Yao, which is a Greek rendering of the Tetragrammaton. That is the name of the Israelite God. For the sake of being respectful here, I haven't actually rendered the entire name. It's just a shortened version, which is just Yah. Sabaoth is also Hebrew, which means of hosts, Sebaot. Both this and the Tetragrammaton appear frequently together in the Hebrew Bible, and well-read Egyptians probably would have been familiar with these two terms as divine names, as we frequently see the names Yahweh and Sabaoth put together on some of this magical material. Lilam or Ililam is a little bit more complicated. We're not sure. It could also be Hebrew. It might render the Hebrew phrase le'olam, which means forever, but we're still not entirely sure. It could be Hebrew in origin. Abrasax is really interesting. This one is very common as well. It's about as common as Yao is. It's actually a Hellenistic Egyptian divine name, and it actually has a numerological nature. Now, in the ancient world, ancient people used letters for name, or letters for numbers, right? So rather than a specific numeral, you would just use a letter to symbol a number. So what that means is that we can actually translate this into all the numbers that they're supposed to represent. 1 to 100, 1, 201, and 60. Now, some quick arithmetic, and we can actually put together the numeric value of the name Abrasax. 365, the number of days in the year. Thus, the name's correspondence to the year was why it was used as a divine name in the ancient world, because it had that sort of astrological significance. Yare-Obazagra is very difficult. This name appears in all sorts of different long strings of divine names, like the one I'm showing you here. In fact, it shows up in one book as one of nearly 100 different names that can symbolize the greatest god. Which is really interesting, right? That's maybe a similar tradition to what we're seeing here, right? Arete is referring to a great god with the name Yare-Obazagra. So let's explore that a little bit more. In this same formula book, there's a ritual to produce an amulet that you would make by chanting to the greatest god at sunrise. And you would use a variety of different names to refer to this god. Some of the Hebrew names we have here, as well as Yare-Obazagra. But these names also include something called the one against Thoth. Now, Thoth is a god of knowledge and of writing and these sorts of things. So who is that supposed to be? It's potentially the god Osiris or Horus, because some traditions where Horus and Seth are fighting, Thoth is helping him. So he helps with the assassination of Osiris, and he helps Seth fight Horus. So maybe we're talking about an Egyptian god here, but it's not certain. But to add to the confusion here, another Egyptian formula book refers to Yare-Obazagra as Aphrodite or Hecate, two other Egyptian Greek gods. Confusion abounds. So who is this greatest god? Frankly, we can't know. That's the thing I'm trying to impress upon you here, is there's too many different valences, too many different names and traditions being invoked in this one term for us to try and pin it down somehow. All of these seemingly point in different directions. So for now, let's leave aside the enigmatic identity of this god and look at something else I want to highlight. This little section down here. Now, this amulet would have been folded up and fastened to Arete's upper arm, what's called the brachion, with a so-called holy thread from the garment. We only know of this because the amulet tells us so. The possible meaning of a holy thread is kind of difficult to tell. It might come from a priest's robes, potentially, but not certain. However, what's interesting to me is that this entire section that I've highlighted here is actually an error. It is a scribal error. It wasn't supposed to be included in the amulet. Usually, these kinds of formulas and spells here were written down in a formula book, and the formula book would include all kinds of rituals that you're supposed to do before creating the amulet and different instructions on how to wear the amulet. So this person clearly went to the formula book to write this down and then didn't realize that the spell had ended, and they just wrote out the instructions of how to wear the amulet afterwards, which is very interesting to me. While I don't have any contemporary examples of this sort of amulet in art, we do see an identical style of amulet wear from this Greek red figure vase. As you can see, the woman here is wearing some sort of small charm bracelet around her upper right arm, which is exactly how Arete would have worn this amulet. But instead of the sort of small charm that we see here, it would have been a square of papyrus. Now, the instructions also note something that's really interesting. Tie cloth to the right bicep with a holy thread. Rakos. However, the amulet we have before us is not rakos. It is papyrus. It is not cloth. It's a completely different material. What's going on here? It's possible that though the prayer here is from a formula book with instructions, the actual instructions themselves weren't followed to the T. So we're thrown for a bit of a loop, right? Though the instructions tell us that this amulet was probably tied to Arate's right bicep with a holy thread, it's not certain that it was, because they're really improvising here. They're using different materials than what is actually being said. This amulet could have been worn in any number of ways because the amulet maker is playing fast and loose with the rules. So let's recap again here. Though this amulet, through this amulet, we come away with a few more insights. Arate was ill with fever and shivers, as we've mentioned. She appealed to a so-called great god to remove that illness from her, and she used a formula book to create the amulet that she wore, but didn't follow the instructions exactly. So again, fever comes to the fore as a major challenge that amulets could have helped with, especially malarial fevers. Arate's amulet also tells us that some amulets were made with the help of formula books that gave amulet makers guidance on how to cure illnesses, probably as part of some larger treatment plan, which included rituals and other medicines. However, these amulet makers were capable of improvising new treatments, even when they were using these kinds of formula books. Perhaps there was no suitable cloth at hand for the maker of Arate's amulet, or maybe the person preferred papyrus for some medicinal reason. Any of these is a possible reading of what's going on here. We can't know for sure. What the amulet maker might have needed the formula book for was the list of the divine names that we saw earlier. The formula book is what likely bore this long list of divine names that we see on the amulet. So what's interesting here is not only do these names not really give us any indication of who the great god is, there's also another issue. It might not even speak to Arate's own religious persuasion or religious sensibilities. Amulets can't always tell us the religious identities of their users, no matter how much we really want them to. But sometimes amulets can tell us this sort of information. At least we can take a very good guess based off of it. Take, for example, this amulet, 5073. I mentioned earlier that amulets are often created based upon some kind of book, some kind of text that operates within a larger ritual context. The same goes for this amulet here, but the so-called formula book the amulet utilizes is the Bible. It's a gospel text, and the potential religious identity of the person who uses this amulet may be a little bit easier for us to guess at. However, what will be potentially surprising here is that this amulet is being used for ritual purposes that won't readily look Christian to our eyes. So many papyrus amulets preserve the entirety of a larger text's first lines, but end kind of abruptly. That's what's going on with this amulet here, which is why I'm calling it a quotation, right? It's just the beginning. Let's extract our text. This is what it is in Greek, and here's what it is in English. Read the beginning of the gospel and see. Beginning of the gospel of Jesus the Messiah, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my angel before you, who will prepare." Now, those of you who know your Bible well might recognize this text. It is the first two lines of the Gospel of Mark. But why would somebody cite such a small portion of this gospel? Scholars call this textual practice, quote-unquote, part for the whole. That is, one small part of a text which gestures and ritually invokes the rest of that text and its spiritual power. But there's an issue with that. The amulet terminates with the word prepare, right? So here's the entirety of the section of Mark. Here's where it cuts off, right in the middle of a sentence. It leaves the rest of the original sentence uncopied. The sheet had more space, but the scribe ended their quote there. Thus, we need to look at a different kind of explanation of what's going on here, rather than the materializing and gesturing towards the Gospel of Mark and its power. Let's return then to the whole text of this amulet, because the small line at the start will probably give us some indications of what's going on here. The amulet starts with a command, anagnoti, read. Read what exactly? Well, if we look at the parallel text, we find out. Read the beginning of the gospel. Interesting. It's mirrored very neatly from the instructions into the text itself. But the amulet has another command for us. Ide, see. See what exactly? We look to the parallel text to find out. That the quote of Isaiah, which is telling us that an angel will prepare. What the amulet is doing here is specifically drawing our attention to this part of the gospel, this specific phrasing. Not just the entire quote, this part in particular is one idea. The angel will prepare. But what will the angel prepare? We've cut off what the gospel originally says the angel will prepare, so maybe it's something different. Well, Jeffrey Smith and A.E. Bernhard, the editors of this amulet, see preparation as potentially ritual. Requests of aid from supernatural beings to help with larger rituals were very common in some of this material. Now, one formula book describes several amulets meant to summon spirit assistants who will grant the user divine knowledge among other benefits. Let's read. If you give the spirit a command, straight away it performs the task. He sends dreams, he brings women and men without the use of ritual material. He kills, he destroys, he stirs up the winds of the earth. He carries gold, silver, bronze, and he gives them to you, whatever you wish, or whenever the need arises, He frees from bonds a person chained in prison. He opens doors. He's a bringer of fire. He brings water, wine, and whatever you may want in the way of foods. He stops ships and releases them. He stops very many evil spirits. He stops wild beasts and will quickly break the teeth of fierce reptiles. He puts dogs to sleep and renders them voiceless. So other than the interesting aspect of this, what really should strike us here is beyond the near omnipotence that the spiritual assistant is going to give the wearer of this amulet, is how this assistant renders other rituals redundant. As the formula asserts, the spirit does its work without the need for ritual ingredients. The most taxing aspect of ritual for most practitioners was the sheer volume of uncommon and downright mythological materials that were expected of the magical practitioner to accomplish their goals. However, if one were to bring a spiritual ally into their employ, then such difficulties would melt away. Did I skip too far? No, we're good. So if this theory is correct, then the wearer would have been the one enjoined to read and then see. Read and see that the angel of Isaiah is invoked to aid the user in some kind of ritual that the angel of Isaiah can help with. This paints a striking picture of an individual who chose a Christian gospel text for an adjuration over the large repertoire of other adjuration texts in formula books. Does this mean the amulet was Christian? Potentially. At the very least, we have some corroborating evidence in the way that this amulet is being written. Remember what I said about long strokes over divine names? We see the same practice here. Yeu Kriu, for Jesus the Messiah. This is a distinctly Christian scribal practice. Whoever wrote this amulet was familiar not only with the scribal traditions and practices of Christian scribes, but also is familiar pretty clearly with the text of the gospel. This is verbatim what other gospel texts at this time largely say about how this Mark gospel begins. So, what can we glean from all of this? This amulet wearer wrote down the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, but cut the passage off at a ritually powerful phrase, indicating that he may have wanted the angel of Isaiah to prepare something for them. Now we're starting to move away from illness as a chief concern in the territory of divine benefit. Recall that I said at the outset of this that protection and healing of amulets were, outside of healing and protection, these amulets were also crafted with the intent of conferring benefits to the wearer. The wearer of this amulet may have had an occasion where they desired divine assistance in their daily life. Thus, they may have unfolded this amulet, read out the Markan passage as an incantation to summon the angel of Isaiah as an assistant. The significance of this amulet for religious identity is that we can say more certainly than with really any of the other amulets we're encountering today, the religious inclinations of this wearer. This person chose a gospel text for their amulet. They seem to have known the gospel text very well and were familiar with Christian scribal practices. Thus, from a modern and very Protestant perspective of Christianity, one might think amulets have no place in the religious life of Christians, but this kind of object puts lie to that misconception. All right. Now, the first three amulets I've shown you have been straightforward in terms of interpretation. This one will not be. This last amulet I'm going to show you has far more space for interpretation. One of the things that we're going to have to do with this particular amulet is try and utilize some of the insights that we've gleaned thus far to understand some possible meanings for this amulet. Now, though they weren't common in Upper Egypt, there were evidently amulet gems like this one used in Oxyrhynchus, as the Egypt Exploration Fund donated this gem to the British Museum in 1906. And actually, that's where this name comes from, right? The name for this amulet is BM, British Museum, 1906, item number 1022.12. So this ovular red jasper depicts the Greek hero Hercules battling the Lernaean Hydra on its front side with nothing on its back, right? There's nothing on the back side. Now this gem was likely used, as many such gems were, in a finger ring or a pendant worn on the body. Now Hercules, interestingly enough, was a common guardian figure, and his labors were often used as part of protective amulets for the body and the home. But this particular scene of Heracles defeating the Hydra isn't actually all that common. In fact, he's usually depicted as a baby strangling snakes sent to kill him by Hera, or as an adult overcoming the Nemean lion. As far as I can tell, this item that we have here from Oxyrhynchus is entirely unique as a gem. So we're going to have to work kind of hard to figure out what might be the uses of this item, as well as some of the significances that it might have had for any wearers. First, let's consider the fact that this is a gem, right? A gemstone. It's red jasper. This was a common gemstone for medicinal purposes, largely because it's red, so it has a connection to the blood of a person. There's some kind of sort of homeopathic sort of connection between these two parts. It also is a very common medium for showing Hercules. Now, the presence of Hercules himself suggests that this gem could have been used for a cure for stomach ailments, like colic. A different gem with Hercules fighting the lion illustrates a connection to colic quite clearly, as it bears this inscription: "Depart, colic, the god pursues you." But why does Hercules get this association with stomach illness? It's kind of odd, right? But interestingly enough, Hercules gets this association in song and literature as being very hungry, gluttonous even, in late antiquity. And it makes its presence seen in a lot of these amulets, that there's this connection. One can easily see that our gem might have been used to deal with some kind of stomach ailment. Just as the lion clawed at Hercules' stomach, so too does colic claw at the wearers. So maybe we can see something similar. The Hydra is clawing at the stomach of the wearer. Anyone aware of the myths about Hercules would know that despite all of these challenges, the hero would still attain victory and apotheosis, and maybe the wearer would see themselves in Hercules, defeating their own challenges. However, as we saw with Arate's amulet and the many names for the great god, you don't need to read this amulet in one way, right? We don't need to read it just through the lens of Greek religion. We can read it in a bunch of different ways. Egypt had many people with many different religious perspectives and persuasions who could have easily seen their own spiritual scenes of victory in this gem. Now, I've already made reference to the god Seth standing on the prow of Ra's solar bark as he passes through the underworld. Somebody from Oxyrhynchus might have looked at this amulet and seen Hercules as Seth, or at least Seth-like, with the Hydra as Apophis, or Apophis-like, being driven off for another day. The many heads of the Hydra, though, might also permit Egyptian Christians to see their own kind of imagery. The Gnostic secret book of John offers physical descriptions of the many principalities that rule our world under the employ of the evil Yaldabaoth. One is strikingly similar to the manner the Hydra is depicted in this gem. The principalities fashion 7 powers for them to use in their rule of the universe, and the fourth is described as Yao, with the face of a serpent and 7 heads. This offers a unique potential reading for the image that a wearer could have used, that this amulet depicts a hero overcoming one of the worldly powers of the demiurge. But a Christian didn't need to be a Gnostic to read this gem and find it potentially significant. Those familiar with the revelation of John could also have seen this Hydra as the seven-headed dragon that menaced the woman with the crown of stars, that is, the devil himself. In this context, Hercules takes on the potential guise of an angel, holding the key to the pit, binding the dragon in chains. The heads, then, might have represented anything from illnesses that could have been attributable to the devil and his demons, or to sins, or even to the enemies of Christian orthodoxy, as the important Christian thinker Origen of Alexandria offers all such interpretations of the dragon's head in his sermon on Psalm 73. Thus, thoughtlessness is a head of the serpent of evil, as is cowardice and irreverence and greed and all other heads of the serpent. According to one lens, I will say that all his principalities are his heads. According to another, the rulers of the heresies. Thus Basilides is a head of the devil, Valentinus a head of the devil, Apelles another head, etc. All of these options are potential readings and usages for this one gem. Now, Véronique Dassen, who's done a lot of work on this sort of material, has written specifically about the multivalence of this kind of powerful imagery, right? Especially in Roman Egypt, where Hellenic, Jewish, Egyptian symbolisms, Christian symbolisms all stood side by side in the ritual repertoire. Thus, we get not a meaning for this object, but a constellation of potential meanings that could have imparted to this one object that any person could have approached it in, that any person approaching this could have imparted to this object in late Roman Oxyrhynchus. Rather than be confounded by this, we should actually be emboldened and excited by the polyvalence of one object like this. By utilizing some of the other amulets and the data that we've been collecting over the course of this presentation, we're actually able to impart a bunch of different, very reasonable and potential readings to this object that say something about how ancient people in the city understood the world around them. This is a world where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Christian ideas about the world and about the way that the world worked sat side by side in the streets of this one town at this one time in history. That simply because we're looking at a stone here and we recognize Hercules and the Hydra doesn't mean that ancient people all saw that thing as well, that they all probably had different ideas about what they were looking at. It also gives us a diversity, but a plausible list of different beliefs that uses that such objects might have had. Even if a text somewhere tells us that this gem might have been used in one way or another, we know that individual people could improvise uses on the fly. People in the practice of their daily lives always improvise in reaction to the world around them, based upon whatever needs they have. Thus, when I propose that this gem might be used in all of these ways, this isn't a situation of either or. All of these are a comprehensive list of the different ways in which this item might have been used throughout its entire lifetime. It may originally have been created as decorative, but then maybe it took on a role of being used as healing ailments of stomach illness. And then maybe it passed on to somebody with a more Egyptian worldview who understood it as defense against the forces of chaos. Maybe it passed into the hands of somebody who's a Christian, a Gnostic or Orthodox person, who saw the victory of good over evil in a cosmic battle and was emboldened by the protection that that would have signified to them. The people I describe here, of course, aren't hypothetical persons. We know these kinds of people existed in the city because of the amulets that we've looked at today. And the question is, did they come in contact with this object? And that's a fun question because we know at the very least that they very well could have. Thank you.